Well, it holds okay. Last week, I did a complete video on how to use the joiner's bench without a vise. You should check that out if you haven't seen it yet, because not having a vise won't keep you from doing anything to a piece of work. But in my experience, most people who don't have a vise just can't afford one. When I started woodworking, it took me a long time to track down a good vise I could afford. So if we're going to add a vise to this bench, it needs to be effective, approachable, and as cheap as possible. Now, when I've got to figure out a problem like this, I like to go to the historical record. And when you look at pictures of historical joiner's benches, you see an awful lot of leg vises. A vise like this makes a lot of sense. You build it to suit your bench and your needs. It's mostly made out of wood, and the only thing you need to buy is the screw. And even a high-quality, all-metal vise screw can be ultra cheap. You can make them yourself out of a scaffold jack. I've done it a couple times. These screws cost less than $25, and I used one in a previous video to make a vise for my low Roman workbench. Now, the cost and quality on these screws is outstanding, but it takes a lot of work to transform the jack screw into an effective vise screw. I'll link to that build down in the description, so you can go that route if you want to. I've done it a couple times, and personally, I'd rather spend a little bit more money on something that's ready to go. For this build, I went straight to Amazon and ordered this Yost vise screw for $43 with free shipping. Straight out of the package, it looks great. Large and sturdy with a hefty Acme thread and all the fittings to make it a plug-and-play bit of hardware. Mine arrived with the nut flipped around so that this long flange would need to be countersunk into the mounting surface. That doesn't make any sense, so I recommend you just flip it around. With the hardware straightened out, all we really need is some wood. Now, ideally, you'd get a big, heavy piece of dense hardwood like this. And I've got a lot of this stuff laying around, but I know a lot of my viewers don't, so we're gonna have to figure out something else. The obvious move is just buying another yellow pine 2x10 and laminating that up for our vise parts. That's a good way to save money, but even though construction lumber is kiln dried, it's not kiln dried very well. Once you get it home, most of it is going to move on you. Again, I'm going to spend just a little bit extra money for material that's more reliable and less work. These yellow pine stair treads are much drier and flatter than any construction lumber, and they're only $10 each. These treads are also laminated from thinner strips of wood, and that makes them very rigid. If I stand right in the middle of one, it only flexes a little bit. By the time I have 3 of them stacked together, all my weight hardly bends them at all. And look, I'm heavy. I weigh 220. I weigh around 220. And these treads will be even stronger once we've laminated them together. Even if you're a hobbyist, you should consider buying glue by the gallon. It's a lot cheaper, and it's nice to have on hand for bigger glue-ups like this that could easily eat through a smaller bottle of glue. You'll want your glue in a thin and even layer. I'm using a large foam brush, but an old credit card works just as well. Be sure to get the glue all the way to the edges, and then sprinkle on a few grains of table salt to keep the pieces from sliding around while you clamp them up. This pine is soft, so I pad my clamps with scrap so they don't ding up the surface. I let my glue dry overnight, and then I'm ready to dress the piece. You can see how effective the viseless bench is, even for big, clumsy stock like this. The crochet makes a great planing stop, and holdfasts keep the work steady while I use my scrub plane to aggressively hog off the bullnose edge from the treads. I've decided to angle my vise at 20 degrees. This way, I can brace it against the bottom of the leg for leverage, while still having the jaws in a comfortable workspace with a little bit of open space to the left. It's how I like to work. This angle is also going to give us some work-holding advantages that I'll show you a little later on. I'll mark out my bottom angle and cross-cut it, and then I'll put the vise jaw in position and mark my second cut line using a couple of spacers. I need to leave extra material on top in case anything changes during the build and I have to adjust anything. Throughout the build, I'm going to cut that top angle in stages, slowly zeroing in on a perfect parallel line between the top of the jaw and the edge of the bench. Now that I know roughly where the vise jaw is going to end up, I can drill for the screw. You'll need to make a 1 1/4 inch hole to fit the vise screw. Luckily, big spade bits work in braces, and they're cheap. I'll leave a link to a good one down in the description. Then I can clamp my jaw over the hole and trace its location. I bore out the jaw, which can also be called the chop, using my low Roman bench. Being able to get up on top of the brace and lean on it makes the drilling go a lot faster. The nut is an easy install inside the apron, although I had to chisel a notch in one of my braces. You'll have to forgive the tight shot here. I've got 2 lights, a camera, a tripod, and my entire body under this little bench. It was not easy to film. I've got the vise temporarily installed on the bench, and the grip is excellent. But the vise chop is so big and heavy that it's clumsy to use. This piece needs to be more streamlined, so I mark out some angled cuts and saw out some big pieces below the screw. The cuts are quick to clean up with a plane and chisel, and now the chop is much lighter without sacrificing any strength. Even though the vise is only about half done, I can already start using it to fabricate more parts. I'll need a handle for my vise screw and end caps to keep the handle in place. Usually these would be round and we would turn them on the lathe, but lots of people don't have a lathe. And a good alternative to round parts is octagonal ones. Any hardwood will get the job done, but I like walnut just for the way it looks. Some of my viewers have been concerned that they won't be able to clamp to this bench because of the big aprons. But an inexpensive pair of holdfasts really takes care of this problem, and I can clamp almost anything, including these small pieces, while I saw and chisel my shapes. For quicker detail work, the vise is delicate enough for small parts. Here, I'm doing roundovers for comfort. I don't own any expensive cabinet rasps, but there's this other tool called a super shear that removes material aggressively while still leaving a nice surface. I'll put a link to it in the description. I'll install my caps with epoxy and wood screws, and my vise is nearly finished. I just need to fine-tune the way that it moves. To make our vise work really well, it's helpful if we understand how it works. So let's assume that this stick with a screw through it is our vise, because our vise basically is a stick with a screw through it. It functions like a lever. The screw provides the force, and then up here at the top of the lever, that's where the force is multiplied, and we get our maximum gripping power. Down at the bottom is the fulcrum, and the fulcrum pivots so that we can get that multiplied force and a tight grip up at the top. Now on a leg vise, the fulcrum is probably the most important part and the part that causes the most problems because it has to do 2 things. It needs to be fixed in place. Otherwise, when you tighten the vise, the whole thing just slides forward and you don't get any gripping power. So it's got to be held tightly down here. But it also has to be adjustable for different lengths of stock. So you've got to be able to bring it in and lock it in place for thin stock, and then bring it out and lock it in place for wider stock. Now, traditionally, woodworkers have had a very solid solution to this problem. It's either called a pin board or a parallel guide. And it's just a board of wood with a bunch of holes bored through it, and then it's mortised into the bottom of the chop and the bottom of the leg. And as you move the vise in or out, you bend down and you jam a pin through the appropriate hole to lock the bottom of the chop in place and get the clamping force you want up at the top with the correct opening. Now, the pin board totally works, but I'll be honest, I have no interest in making one. It's going to pretty much double the time of the build to make it and fit it properly. And then every time I want to change the setting of my vise, I have to bend down, pull the pin out, adjust the vise, and jam the pin back in again. All kidding aside, I'm a little bit lazy, and that completely does not appeal to me. Luckily, there are a bunch of modern solutions to this problem. There are linear guide bearings and fancy chain drive units. My favorite is probably the St. Peter's Cross, which is mechanically simple and works very, very effectively. Now, all of these solutions can be bought for kind of a lot of money, and a lot of them you can make at home for kind of a lot of time. And I'm not really interested in doing any of those for this low-to-the-ground DIY build. I've got a much simpler solution. I've taken a piece of scrap wood and cut it into this wedge shape. It's straight along this end and tapered along this end. Then I took this shape and I copied the angle of this taper to the bottom of my chop, and I cut an angled shallow rabbet so that the 2 things fit together really nicely. Now this simple wedge allows me all of the adjustment and holding power I could need for the bottom of my chop. When I want to open the chop up for very wide stock, I just kick the wedge to the left, and that moves the wider part of it in, holds the bottom of the chop open further, and allows me to grip big pieces of wood at the top of the vise. If I need to close the vise more and grip thinner stock, I just kick it to the right. I get the shallow portion of the wedge in under the chop, and that lets me grip thin stock, really all the way down to a business card. This provides all the adjustability I could possibly need. I don't have to bend down, I just kick it back and forth with my foot, and believe it or not, it works really well. It's fantastic. Now, I can't take credit for this idea. Chris Schwartz and Jay Bates both use these in their leg vises, and that's where I got the idea from. Jay in particular has a fantastic video on it. I will link to it down in the description so you can see another woodworker's take on this solution. Okay, next problem. Without a parallel guide, the bottom of the vise is free to rotate, so the top edge is always falling out of alignment with the top of the bench. But if I kick the bottom of the vise tight against the floor, you can see how that low corner comes back up right where I want it. The solution to this is simple. The brace and leg at the bottom of the bench form a convenient little track. If I drill a hole in my chop and tap in a piece of hardwood dowel, then the chop can't rotate, and it will be held tight to the floor. If you want more details on any of this, I've got a great set of plans down in the description, and they're reasonably priced. The last thing I need to do is contour the top of the chop to keep it out of the way of my tools. I cut off a big chunk of waste with a saw, and then I plane in a nice curve. The sharp edges of the chop are also fragile, so I chamfer those with a plane and chisel. Chamfered edges stand up to being hit much better than sharp corners. I do a little more detail work and make sure the top edge of the chop is perfectly parallel with the top of my bench, and the vise is done. When I went to add a vise to my joiner's bench, I did all the research and I looked at every vise design I could think of. And I finally settled on the leg vise because it just seemed like the most versatile vise you could possibly have. It'll grip any size of stock, it'll grip different widths, it'll hold boards along the apron for planing, it'll hold them for sawing. It pretty much does everything, except leg vises aren't always awesome for joinery, like if you want to put dovetails on the end of a wide board. Well, that's where angling the vise comes in. Canting it over at 20 degrees like this actually puts the vise screw right here. So I have this big section of the vise free of the screw that I can use to clamp boards in. This board right here is oak. It is a full 12 inches long. It's the widest hardwood board I have in my shop. The vise grips it great. Now there's one little problem with using this vise for joinery, which is that this board is only being gripped on one side of the screw. That means the vise jaw wants to rack side to side a little bit. This is no big deal. I just took a little offcut of hardwood and put a screw in it to keep it from falling through the vise. When I want to dovetail a piece of stock like this, I drop that little spacer into one side of the vise and put my board in the other side. Now I've got a rock-solid hold with no racking and no problems. This isn't the ultimate vise for every single possible operation, but it is an outstanding compromise, especially for people like me who do a lot of general woodworking and not a ton of cabinet making. I don't cut a lot of dovetails, I cut them sometimes, and so this situation is perfect for me. If you'd like to build this big, sturdy, versatile vise, I have an excellent set of plans, and you can click the link for those down in the description, or you can pick them up at rexkruger.com/store. And speaking of plans, I really want to be able to say to you, hey, the joiner's bench is done. I've got deluxe plans. You should buy them. You should build this bench. But I don't know. I feel like I can't really say that yet because I just finished the bench. I've hardly used it. I don't know how good or bad it is. So I think the responsible thing for me to do is take a couple of weeks and use this bench. Make a couple of projects with it, build a couple things around the house, and then come back to you and tell you how the bench performs. What's it good at? What's it mediocre at? I'm sure it's not perfect at everything, and my viewers deserve a full accounting of everything it can do before I ask you to invest in my plans. Now, in the meantime, you might be interested in learning more about the joiner's bench and following along more with my progress. Well, there's a group of people who gets a lot more information about this build. My patrons on Patreon. They got an exclusive article all about the history of it. They've gotten additional exclusive videos, progress shots, sneak peeks. They get to ask me questions, which I always answer really quickly. My patrons just get more information about this stuff because their support made this possible. And Maybe you'd like to be one of these people too. If you'd like to be part of this amazing community of craftspeople, go on over to patreon.com/RexKruger and check out the early access, free plans, and exclusive content that I have only for my patrons, the people who make these videos happen. And of course, I wouldn't be here at all if it weren't for my viewers. I'm going to come back in a couple weeks and tell you a lot more about this bench, so come back and join me. Thanks so much for watching.